What is going on, happy people? It is the big Signorelli, and you are watching the Parallax Viewer. Now, before we go on to this discussion, which I am really happy that I'm finally doing this, and this is also spontaneous because I didn't plan on at least doing it today, but I felt compelled and inspired. But I'm not sure if I want to keep the Parallax Viewer. Maybe somebody could put in the comments if they think it's good. Apparently, there's another podcasts similar to that. I think they're called the Parallax View. And so yeah, I don't know. I might change it. I might keep it. I might just keep it to the big Signorelli. It's self-titled channel, but y'all let me know for any of those that actually pay attention to this learning platform and actually give a fuck. But without further ado, if you're watching this, then you came here for a specific reason, and that is to learn about an infamous and most daunting, challenging topic regarding Lacan, and that is the graph of desire. Yes, we are going to go over the graph of desire. I plan on doing maybe a three-parter, not two-parter, but this one will be, of course, the introduction. All right. And we're going to draw specifically from his essay in the Acree, which I want to say was published around 1961. Let's see. It is the Subversion of the Subject and the Dialectic of Desire in the Freudian Unconscious. Sorry, it was given as a presentation in September 19th to the 23rd, 1960. And this essay sort of forges like the turning point regarding, you could say, his theory of the subject, as well as the way he would shift the orientation of his teaching. It's right before Science and Truth. So, for Milner, Jean-Claude Milner, who I'm very influenced by, says that Science and Truth represents the sort of turning point in Lacan's teaching with regards to his relationship to science. And I think maybe Subversion of the Subject is somewhere along the lines because, well, first, what does it mean to subvert the subject, right? And what subject are we talking about? Because philosophy, throughout the entire continental tradition, uses the term subject. When we think of subject, sometimes we think of subjectivism, like, my sort of personal experience versus what is objective. I know a lot of analytical bros will conflate subject with subjectivism, which I guess kind of like conflated with like some sort of like relative experience. But the subject is specific to Lacan, in which it is both in Greek the hypokaimenon, the underbelly of what is foundational, and the subject has nothing to do with consciousness or mind, right? In the way that philosophy sort of relates to that. And I talk about this in an essay that I actually written that I'm revising, but I would like to publish on my Medium and Substack and possibly make a video presentation regarding it. I gave a presentation at Psychology and the Other in Boston, which was a couple weeks ago. But needless to say, that's a digression. The point is, it's not necessarily defining what the subject is, because if you're familiar with Lacan, the subject has to do with not only the subject of the unconscious, but also a subject submitted and split by the signifier, right? And represented by such thing, which is the signifier, to a series of other signifiers. And it's not localizable. It's rather absent. But to subvert it means to subvert the process in which it seems to determine itself within the discourse, and by discourse specifically, the discourse of science. And the subject that is being subverted is the subject of science and its quest to try to apprehend the field of knowledge. And this field of knowledge is constituted as the other. Of course, science would not use these terms, but it is Freud's discovery of the unconscious, Freud's relationship to science, and Lacan's sort of bird's eye view, if you were to call that such, of the relationship of psychoanalysis to the modern subject and modern science, and how the quest to sort of have a big toe of everything, the ability to complete the system of knowledge, to use a signifier that would complete the other, seems to be subverted in the process, because the subject is also related and comes about from the other, capital O, comes about from the field constituted by signifiers, which is the field of science, right? So there's a lot going on. And that's a lot of stuff that will also be fleshed out insofar as I'm making a lot of presentations on Lacan. And then also another reminder, I will still continue to work on the Seminar 16 project, just a lot of life variables and also other projects coming up, in which I'm getting sort of sidetracked, but I feel like it'll all come together. It'll all quilt, to use a Lacanian term. But let's talk about understanding this graph. This graph should be seen as what is called an ontogenetic reconstruction. And that doesn't come from me. This actually comes from a fellow colleague who pointed that out. And they really changed my perspective on looking at this graph of desire. And so I'll share my screen right now, and we could see exactly screen the preliminaries before starting this essay or a presentation regarding the graph. So I could make another entire video on the signifier, and I think I could just hark on the signifier in every other video that I talk about. But in order to understand the graph of desire, we also have to understand its roots, which is related to the subject and the signifier, as well as the big other. This also relates to ontogenesis and the fact that what is ontogenesis and ontogenetic reconstruction? It's a fancy term by Freud to talk about the development of one's individual makeup, ontological makeup, not biological makeup. I think that's more phylogenesis and has to do with what is passed down hereditarily, if that's a word. But the ontogenesis is, for psychoanalysis, is sort of trace the structural developments of one's psychic functioning and the sort of way in which we pinpoint the root of one's suffering, one's neurosis, psychosis, etc. And the signifier is what is going to manifest in relationship to one's symptom, right? It is a representative that stands in for the unconscious trauma and symptomatically manifests through language and through speech. But we got some formal definitions right here that I put in my notes. This isn't a PowerPoint, by the way. This is just some notes. And if you notice, if you can see this on the screen, we have a big S, this bar, and a little s. This is flipped around because the original one comes from Saussure, the structural linguistic theorist, in which there is a binary relationship between the signified, the thing being referred to for someone, and the signifier, sort of, I guess, as he calls it, an audio image. And so the sign is what it's called, which constitutes the signifier, the audio image, and a referent, thing being referred to. And I should clarify, because this is a little technical. Signifiers don't necessarily refer to, in the Saussurean sense, to physical things. They refer to meaning or concepts, right? So everybody loves to use the cat example, the word cat, and then the meaning of the cat, or the referent to cat, right? And it's the binary thing. But Lacan flips it on its head and privileges the autonomy of the signifier over the signified, because we don't have a closed field of meaning, which everything refers to something for someone. We have an autonomous law of signifier, which instantiates difference. And so difference and the signifying function take a radically different angle compared to the field of meaning, and meaning takes on only an effect, something I guess you could say secondary to the instantiation of difference and differentiality. And if you've paid attention to our seminar 3 aspect, or seminar 3 series on the vanishing meteors, the aspect of the symbolic nihilation, in which when there is the signifying function in the symbolic order, there is a negative process, because the signifier doesn't have a referent, it doesn't have an essence, it's not an abstract concept. The signifier is just a law of presence and absence, and I put that right there in the list, right there. So let me read it out. So the signifier has an autonomous law, and the signifier is privileged over the signified, which I pretty much said. And the signified is literally a point of effect due to the signifying chain, because it's not just one signifier, you got a bunch of signifiers. And that's because by definition, a signifier cannot refer to itself for meaning, but it relies on another signifier to generate meaning, the effect, right? It's just a series of ones and zeros. The signifier has an a priori law of presence and absence, right? So it stands in for something that is absent. And what is absent in the psychoanalytic investigation is the subject, right? And so the signifier also not only has this synchronic function of like taking on various combinations, but there's also the diachronic factor in which change in time and the change of meaning through time, through the discourse, have precedence as well. And one of the things that Lacan will take from another linguist, Roman Jakobson, is this idea of metaphor and metonymy. And this plays a huge role in the graph of desire. I'll explain this more when I show you the graph. But then lastly, the signifier is what represents the subject to another signifier. And the latter signifier is therefore the signifier to which all other signifiers represent the subject. This is quoted from pagination 819 in the Acree. And so it's because of linguistics that we get out a sort of form of science which deals with formalisms and axioms. But Lacan doesn't want to reduce everything to language. What he's trying to get is that language offers the pathway to the Freudian discovery of the unconscious or the subject. It's a point in which we could actually recognize the subject of science as well as the unconscious formation that an individual suffers with or suffers from. And this is the first graph right here, the first graph of desire. Graph number 1 should be taken as a logical starting point to understand the rest of the graph. This doesn't go away when we get to the final graph. This is still operative. And also, I think it's principal, in my opinion, to how the graph itself functions and what I mean by that. So let's break this down. The line going from left to right horizontally, this is the signifying chain of articulation. This is where the big other is. This is everyday language and where signifiers are produced. This is the big other, as we will see later on. but this is just the chain of the signifiers. And I drew some of these circles on here, and I'll explain this in a bit, if you can see. What we have at the bottom, at the starting point, which makes its way up and around from right to left, is what Lacan will call the line of articulated or rational discourse. And in the psychoanalytic investigation of the unconscious and the formation of desire, we have to take the starting point as not a split subject per se, but it doesn't mean that there's a subject that is whole prior to the split subject. This is a formulation, this delta of need, the need from the child who is dependent by the other of language, whether it be the mother function or the paternal function. It could be anybody, but that they are immersed within a field of language and where signifiers are spawned from. So need enters into this aspect, which will then become the locus of speech and the locus of signifiers, the big A. And then it comes back around, and it is what's called Spaltung. This is the primordial splitting that creates the subject. So this is how the split subject is spawned. It is split by the field of signifiers. Signifiers, or the signifier, will split the subject. Subject of need, or the need expressed, filtered by what we'll then see as demand. And I'm kind of going ahead, but that's how we get a subject, right? As soon as it enters into language, it is already being split by the signifier. And I should emphasize that point, that there's a specificity between language, which is like a field. It's not an idealism. It's not this metaphysical field. It's just the fact that we live in a social world, a social bond, and we speak, and language structures that speech. And the field of linguistics is able to create a science about language. And the signifier for structural linguistics is that structural unit, that elementary unit of language. But for Lacan, we're immersed into everyday language and everyday discourse, right? And from that, signifiers emerge. For Lacan, signifiers are specifically for psychoanalysis versus the Saussurean use of the signifier or the sign. And that it's not just a referent for someone, but it's actually something that is symptom or what creates the unconscious subject. And it's because of this autonomous law of difference and differentiality. And so another point about graph number one is that, as I said earlier, this is like the principal function for all other graphs. He'll also call this the button tie, the quilting point, the point de capitan, in a way in which if this arrow of need, right, is articulating the discourse rationally, what it's doing is trying to intercept this field of language and signifiers. What it's trying to do is anticipate and ascertain what the field of the other is articulating. I love you. You're such a wonderful child. The subject of need, who is the baby of need who is crying, enters into this aspect. There is a code, something that is foreign, because the baby doesn't have that ability to ascertain what the other is, but tries to, and reverts it back into a message for it to instantiate itself and thus become a subject, right? But also, when we speak, we have to also account for not only the subject and the predicate, but also the retroactive effect that makes one understand. If I just say I, that's the equivalent of pointing. If I just point, there's no discourse, there's no effective meaning. But if I say you, okay, now you may be reflected back and You're like, okay, he's addressing me, but you still doesn't really get at the heart of what's being addressed or being evoked. If I say you, okay, the imaginary effect of the loud audible noises that you could say is yelling or aggressive may indicate something else, but there's still anticipatory meaning that is being left out, like that still needs to be articulated, that needs to be anticipated, right? If I say you are the best, okay, now retroactively we understand what the you was referring to, right? If I say I am addicted, all right, if I just stop it right there, we think like, okay, he's got an addiction. I am addicted to talking about Lacanian theory to the internet world. Right? So this is the elementary function of the graph, in which there's an anticipatory status to the chain of articulation in this field of language, speech, and discourse, and then the delta of need that comes up and around to try to ascertain the code and receive it as a message, right? The other is encoded, encrypted, right? And the subject receives it in a message in which it can only comprehend certain amounts of that information. It won't know everything about the other, but yet it's dependent on the other. And I mentioned metaphor and metonymy. So metaphor and metonymy become important because what metaphor and metonymy does, right? So metaphor, it just doesn't have anything to do with like figurative language, like similes. Metaphor is very technical in this chain because it has to do with substitution of a signifying chain. Metonymy is decomposing or breaking up that signifying chain, right? Simple ways to understand metaphor metonymy is like the difference between saying bifocals and saying glasses, because metonymy is like it's like reducing something to its part, and metaphor is rather a substitution. And yet there is, you could say, a dialectic between the two in the signifying chain, in which something could be broken down metonymically, and then at the same time it could be placed down as a substituting effect, right? Which is another topic. I can't say that like I myself am at least the best when it comes to understanding the interplay of this in the signifying system, but I at least understand it to a specific aspect that they serve a specific function for Lacan, metaphor and metonymy. And I guess I'll show you a lot more when I have more elements of the graph to be able to articulate the way we could see metaphor and metonymy. Just to be able to talk about it with only this graph, we don't give you, it doesn't really give you that much, right? But if we remember like the forgetting of names, the way that words break down, the example of Signorelli is like an example of metonymy in which like things get broken up and then they get substituted or they get forgotten. Metonymy is that aspect, as I said, of like not only reducing the reduction of meaning, but also the decomposition of the signifying chain in which things can become broken up, dislocated from meaning, you could say. And I really like this line that he says right here. Far from giving myself over to logicizing reduction where desire is at stake, I detect desire's irreducibility to demand the very mainspring of what also prevents it from being reduced to need. To put it elliptically, it is because desire is articulated that is not articulable, by which I mean in the discourse that suits it, an ethical, not a psychological one. So Lacan refers to this first graph as the quilting point. And also with this, which where desire will come about, is the sliding of meaning. right? The indefinite sliding of the signifier because of its, I use the term autonomy because I think that's what's in the text and also in Seminar 5. But I like to use the term the anarchy of the signifier. I don't know if I got that from somewhere, if I just like made that up in my own head, but it's like because of the radical law of the signifiers of difference, and it follows difference, there is this indefinite sliding of the signifier, and that allows for not only the process of substitution via metaphor, but also the decomposition of that chain, the dislocation of that via metonymy, right? And it's based on the phonetic level, right? The internal phonemes that happen within language, right? I mean, I could keep dragging on and on about this, but like, again, I mean, we could read this right here. In this elementary graph, the button tie or the quilting point is the effective diachrony of the sentence and the retroactive effect, but the synchrony is the process of metaphor and metonymy. In Lacan's own words, the child, by disconnecting the thing from its cry, raises the function of the sign to the signifier, and reality to the sophistics of signification. And in his contempt for verisimilitude, makes necessary the verification of multiple objectifications of the same thing. And that sounds a little all over the place, but the reality is that reality for the child is not this sort of immediate thing, but already structured off of this fundamental cry, this demand, which transubstantiates itself to the level of the signifier. And so he's immersed, or he or she, or they or them, or immersed in language, right? And you know, I used gendered pronouns, but it doesn't matter the gender or even the gender of the caretaker, or it doesn't even have to be a physical person. We could see how maybe one's imaginary relationship, as well as their symbolic and real structure, differ if they live in like a group home, you know, or they're orphans. I was sure there would be an imaginary investment or frustration or aggression, but I still think there would be something like neurosis or psychosis that could emerge if there was something traumatic or something that would then produce something pathological, like but I think I'm kind of going on a digression. The point I'm trying to make about this quote is that the child is already thrown into the field of language by speaking beings, and it's from the demand, from the ruthless, indifferent forces of sociality and of nature and its own infantile, impotent body, that the cry then elevates itself to the level of the sign or into the field of the other, whose code will refer to him in the form of a message, and he'll carry that message no matter if he knows the message or not, or he has the language to interpret that accurately. You could translate it, to use a Laplanchian term. We could see that the first graph is a play off of two chains, to sum this up: the chain of the signifier and the chain of the subject via a need, or the baby. When the need enters up into the right point of the horizontal chain, the subject encounters the code of the other. We need where need is then inscribed by demand. The trajectory of the subject makes a retroactive move to the upper left of the chain, where it receives the message. The final effect is the subject returning to the bottom left as a divided subject. The subject submitted to by the signifier, submitted to the signifier. And let's go over message and code, because this isn't the second graph per se, but this has like the sort of coordinates for graph number 2. But this sort of gets at what I was trying to articulate, and it's the fact that the same process of the subjective need enters in. But now that we have language, now that the baby or the child subject is immersing itself through the signifying chain and making a rationalized discourse about it, we can see how metaphor and metonymy will operate. So metaphor is generated right here. from the point of the message. And at this point, we could see how there was multiple vectors and I color coded them. The need could come up this way and then continue to articulate itself from the sentence or the messaging code, the statements, the field, and it could come back around and complete itself. Or it could simultaneously from metonymy take something, break it down, and then stay right here, right? So you have more than one operation going. You have this one, which looks like if I go all the way up, around and down, looks like graph number one. But because of the indefinite sliding, we could come back around here. And let's add some elements into this, or structure, I should say. We have the symbolic order in which language is ordered, articulated, enumerated, systematized. It's a machine. And yet we have also the product of the imaginary investment in which identifications occur, right? Right here. And you notice how I put the letter I? So the index of the I is now taken into account. And it could slide anywhere in this right here. It could go up here to try to meet the message with the subject, or it could stay right here in imaginary meaning. What I'm getting at is for graph number 2, which looks a lot like this, we now get into some elements that we are familiar with, right? This is almost similar to El schema, but right here we can see the birth of the ego, the ideal ego, and the ego ideal. And notice on this one, compared to graph number 1, we start as a split subject submitted to by the signifier, right? We start with the split subject. And this implies that a subject is already split by the signifier. And in the very first graph, not only is it a button tie at quilting point, but an already instantiation of spaltum, of splitting. And we have all these funny mathings that are like symbols that look confusing as fuck, but we'll break it down. So right here, this is still this arrow is still the chain of articulated or a chain of articulated signifiers and signification. But now we have the voice, right? We have the signifier and the voice. We have S and A. We have A. And then right down here, we have I, little a, M, big I, big A. What the fuck did those mean? All right. So with the second graph, and I'm gonna bring out my notes. We should see this as not only the primacy of the symbolic, but also the way in which the imaginary register hooks onto the symbolic point. The subject of the signifier is still there, but it takes an imaginary misrecognition by being caught in the lure of the other, which creates this ego, right? The ego is right here, but it has a fixed image, an idealized image, a lure, right? This is the mirror stage flattened out into a topology, right? We're now seeing how its GPS functions, right? This is the GPS of the subject. So signifiers come through right here. And as the subject split comes up, it's already misrecognizing itself. And so it could stay right here at the level of the imaginary processes of the ego and come up here to this thing right here, S and A. S and A stand for the subject of enunciation, right? So notice how, and I'm going fast, but I'll break this down. Notice how this arrow cuts through S and A and also cuts through A. A now stands in as the big other, as the treasure troves of signifiers to which the signifier that splits the subject represents the subject to. And this process of going through right here, we should see this as its own circuit, right? Just this right here, and this can be its own thing. This is this back and forth process of the voice in which there's a treasure troves of signifiers that speak and trying to interpret the message, right? This is a place that the split subject tries to intervene in. This is a moment in which the subject is enunciating something about the discourse of the other, the big other, right? And this has a more symbolic, you could say, dimension. But because of the libidinal investment of the ego, it could go misrecognized, especially if it does it from this angle, right? Especially if it comes from right here. Now, right here is the ego ideal, right? And it has to come down to right here. It's the ego ideal is now something instantiated because of the big other symbolically, something that the subject is trying to achieve. So these former splits, the spaltung, are marks by the signifier, the unary trait, and are built up into an idealized point right here. And I wrote some definitions down regarding this, but we should see it right here. Like, I'll read it out. Like the big S, we'll start with the big S, big A, or it's actually like a small S, big A. It's the locus of the I statement, right? So remember how I said right here, there was I up in the message. It takes the form right here and can be used as an index to symbolize the ego and its multifaceted aspects of ideal ego and ego ideal. And it also shifts up into these locus of I statements, right? It is the locus of I statements, which is determined retroactively, right? So it's still the same process. I am annoyed with you, mom. I love my mom, maybe. And I love to annoy her. I see that's where like I will expose my own weakness and my own lack about how the functions of these graphs are going. But we're learning, right? But I think that's how it would operate. Because I already know for a fact that this is like the imaginary relation, but it's like, okay, you see how the arrows are going up here to the field of I statements, and so is this one. So it's like it's understanding the discourse of the other, and at the same time trying to also articulate it from an imaginarized point, right? And I always see the imaginaries having this sort of like affective dimension, but also like aggressive, loving dimension. Whereas the symbolic articulation on the above is more of like the sort of insistence of the anarchy of the signifier, right? We haven't even gotten to the dimension of the real yet. But I like what this quote from Seminar 11 says, that in this respect is what may be called the punctuation, in which signification ends as the finished product. It's where the symptom manifests itself, right? And it's coming in from two directions, right? The misrecognition and the symptom, the cry of whatever message of the other comes about. And this is the place, right, of the other. This is a punctual moment. And what this is also trying to do is sort of in these I statements that are accumulated right here, the symptom, is to close the circuit. It's a failure of closing. It's a failure of meaning, but it's a punctual point where meaning fails, right? It says right here, I have some quotes regarding the interplay of SA and then big A. The first labeled A is the treasure trove of signifiers, which does not mean the code for the one-to-one correspondence between the sign and a thing is not preserved here. The signifier being constituted on the basis of a synchronic and countable collection in which none of the elements is sustained except through its opposition to each other. The SA, which is the second label, is what may be called the punctuation in which signification ends as the finished product. Kind of read that already. But let us observe this symmetry between on the one which is the locus, the place, rather than a space, right? And that's the big A that he's referring to. And the other, which is a moment, a scansion, rather than a duration. So it's a punctual moment, not like a length of time. It's just like this insistent cut. This is what's important in analysis when some unconscious slippage manifests and an other than my empirical individual self speaks through my speech. It is the enunciated statement, but the interplay of enunciation also operates. Seeing the other graphs. But like this top portion of the signifier and the voice with S and A is this sort of impossible circuit of close. Like it tries to close itself. It tries to close meaning onto itself, but fails to, right? And this manifests as a symptom, right? As a rupture. It's unable to close in on itself, a scansion, a failing of an act in which it would find its certainty. It refers back only to its own anticipation in the composition of the signifier. And remember when I was giving that example about anticipation of like, you know, when I was like, you, right? We could see that there's an anticipation in the unconscious with something like this, because these moments where the failure to close upon itself operates in the free association because something is said and the analyst intervenes on that moment to surprise the analysand of what they said. They said that they said something where they weren't there, like meaning, sure, I'm right here speaking, but what I said that the analyst intervenes is not coming from me, but coming from the other somewhere else. Who is it that's speaking? It is that subject of the unconscious that's somewhere in the other. It's at some place, and at that moment, at that particular spontaneous speech act, that's where it's cut at, right? And so I'm anticipating, as someone who failed in speaking, whether it's a bungled action like a slip of the tongue, a forgetting of the name, or I said something that was full of I wasn't going to say full of meaning, but full of signification that relates to the unconscious, that relates to my symptom. It's so foreign to me that I'm trying to anticipate what the fucking clues are, similar to like the person who's anticipating what I'm going to say when I say you, right? Think of it like that. Yeah, I could go on and on and on. I mean, I barely talked about the bottom portion, but the bottom portion is literally just it's also the slighted of metonymy, right? Because it's trying to decompose meaning, and also it tries to refer back to sort of an identification or imaginary investment of one's ego. I've obviously said that that bottom portion relates to the imaginary process, in which little ia is the lure, it's the mirror stage moment, right? Where there's a fixed image that the subject misrecognizes itself, that's caught up in by saying like, that's me, the body, or the voice of the mother saying, that's you, you're that baby in the mirror, or whatever. And it's a fixed image. And the ego has that function of misrecognition and misrecognizing the process that the subject is caught up in. And then the ego ideal not only relates to like the accumulations of the unary trait, which is like this sort of mark of identification, but it also is how the subject tries to fix itself in the place, right? The subject's already misrecognized itself in this imaginary process, but then rather than fixating on the narcissistic lure, the image, it tries to, or rather than focus on the fixed image, which is narcissistic, it tries to fix itself. It's focused on positioning itself in a sort of idealized position, right? And this becomes a problem. It's not a perfect thing, even though we see like a perfect like a circuit that's, you know, connecting the dots everywhere. This is like an impossible process because of what these symbols are trying to convey to us, this impossibility of closure. This is a symptom right here. And it is also the problem of the other, because it's what's going on, and desire is about to come up. I'll talk about it in a later video, but this is, we already have the egoic formation, but also we have this impossibility of understanding the code via the message, trying to close it, right? So the subject is caught in this problem of demand, witnessing a code, interpreting the messages of the code, but failing, right? And so it's trying to go in multiple ways, while also trying to complete itself right here. So I don't know if that was helpful. I don't know if I confused you guys more, but I think I'll still post this. I'll definitely post this, but I still think I will leave it right there and post this and uh conclude the presentation for today, and then we'll discuss the last two graphs in the next one. And I think after reflecting on this presentation, maybe there'll be more I could clarify and add, because this, like I said in the beginning, this is like a very, it's difficult, but it's also, once you actually dive through the graphs on your own and understand the coordinates and the trajectories, the logic of it, um, it's really not that hard to grasp. It's just another thing to try to explain it to somebody who may feel like, oh shit, I don't understand any of this at all. So, yeah, hope this was helpful. Stay tuned and enjoy y'all's symptom, and never cede ground relative to your own desire. Peace, y'all.